All right. Hi, guys. So, here we go. Okay, so this presentation is going to go along with your evolution notes packet. So this is a new unit today, starting with evolution. I don't know why, but there is a ton of evolution stuff on the air test. So I urge you guys to please make sure to listen to the lectures. As we go along, the notes this unit are, some of them are actually designed that so you'll kind of do them on your own. So please, as you go through the Google Slides that I use in this unit, make sure you're like actually reading. You're looking at the examples, and you're learning. So the new notes packet looks like this. It should say evolution notes. And today we're going to do just the first page here. So here we go with evolution. I think it's important to realize how much scientific evidence there is for the process of evolution. We will actually spend like a full day in this class just looking at the physical evidence of evolution. So evolution is the gradual change in a population over time. So we see evolution occurring like it takes like a very, very, very long time, right? It's not something that happens quickly. So remember, evolution is a well-supported explanation of phenomena that have occurred in the natural world. So it's very well supported, and there's lots of physical evidence. So the example that is really commonly used with evolution and to show the changes in evolution is a peppered moth. So in 1848, a naturalist named Edelson was studying peppered moths in England, and he recorded having found a wild discovery, a black peppered moth. This was very rare, and he only found a few. So if you look at my picture here, you can see that most of the moths here on this image are like grayish or peppered, right? So black and white speckled. And occasionally he would find in England, he would find a rare individual of that species that was all black. Okay. So here's a real image of these moths. And you can see on this image, there's a peppered and a black. So the black is really obvious on this tree that's covered with lichen, is what we call that growth. And then the peppered one is right here, if you can kind of see it. So the peppered moth you can see is like perfectly camouflaged for the trees in the forest where it lives that are covered with this lichen growth. Okay, so hit the peppered moth here, and then the rare black moth. So here you can see my little picture on the tree bark. You can see my peppered moth and then my black moth. So what do you think happened to the black moths? Well, if you're a hungry bird, which moth is going to be easiest to see and gobble up? The black one, right? So the black moths were eaten, and the lighter moths survived and made babies and passed on the genes to be pepper colored to their babies, okay? So light moths were really successful. They survived and made light moth babies. Over the next 50 years, things changed. So by 1900, peppered moth populations were recorded to be about 95% dark moths. So scientists were very curious as to why this species had changed in such a short period of time. Here you can see a picture of them actually mating, and it's interesting to see the peppered moth with the black moth, and they are actually the same species. So what we contribute to the peppered moth example is the Industrial Revolution. So scientists discovered that an increase in factories and pollution had killed the lichen on those trees, and now the trees were just covered in black, gross soot. So now what we see is the tree bark looked something like this picture. Okay, so the light colored lichens were died, killed off. And then bark now was not only like brown bark, but it was also covered in soot because of so many factories releasing so many pollutants. So what do you think happened now? Which one of these organisms seems best fit for survival? Yes, the black ones. So now we see the white peppered moths are going to be eaten, and then the dark moths are going to survive and make dark moth babies. So what the population that looked like this with maybe one rare black moth, it slowly started being more successful. So it started surviving, right? Surviving and having babies and passing on the gene to be dark colored. So slowly after a few generations, we saw more dark colored moths, and then we saw more dark colored moths, and so on and so on and so on until the population actually changed. And we saw we see a majority of the moths being black colored, and then now just a few that are going to be the peppered. So before pollution and then after. So that peppered moth population evolved. Okay, so to put it all together and in your notes, so originally the light color moths were the most successful because they were well camouflaged on the lichen covered trees. Then during the Industrial Revolution, the lichen died and the trees became covered in soot. Now the light colored moths were quickly eaten and the dark moths were well camouflaged. Over time, the population became primarily dark because those were the most successful. So there was an actual change in gene frequency, which is what we call evolution. Whoops. Okay, so let's take a look at a few of the scientists. So one scientist named Lamarck was actually the first to publish a book about evolution, but he didn't get much attention. He made a few important points, like he was looking at some of the right things, but his explanation of why they were occurring had major flaws. So his explanation of evolution stated that there was actually, it depended on like use or disuse of traits that would ultimately affect the organism. So traits could be enhanced by use or lost by disuse. The results would be passed on to the offspring. So for example, using muscles would make them larger and then their offspring would be born with larger muscles. So like my huge bicep muscles that I've worked really hard for, it's not true. If that were true though, imagine I had huge biceps and I would pass them on to my babies. Well, you guys know that that's not the case, right? So those are things that you're going to produce during your lifetime. Clipped ears of dogs could be passed. Another example, sorry, is the clipped ears of dogs could be passed off to offspring. So an example I actually don't know much about it is Doberman dogs. Typically when they're born, they clip their ears so they stand up nice and pointy like the one on the left here. And so Lamarck would have believed that that trait could be passed off on to the offspring. So he believed that giraffes' necks got longer and longer and longer because they literally stretched. So he believed that a giraffe would live throughout its lifetime, it would stretch its neck and then pass on the stretched neck gene to the offspring. So Lamarck is important because he was the first to claim that a species changes over time. So again, he realized that there is change occurring, but his explanation was just totally wrong. Nowadays, the scientists that we credit with fully understanding and explaining the process of evolution is Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin was alive during the 1800s. So he was born in 1809 and lived to 1882. He was a very educated naturalist, actually, that sailed around the world on a 5-year trip, just making constant observations about the diversity of life that he saw, animal behaviors that he got to observe, and so on. Here is the ship that he sailed around was called the Beagle. So this is the Beagle's voyage. You can see he spent 5 years sailing around the globe and stopping a lot. So he would make frequent stops and just observe. So again, he was what we call a naturalist, right? So he was out in the field, watching organisms and really trying to make sense of what he was seeing from place to place. So he spent a lot of time on the Galapagos Islands studying their tortoises, marine iguanas, and finches. And the Galapagos Islands are a cluster, a small group of islands west of South America. And although they're close together, what he noticed was that the islands are actually quite different. So this clump of islands, he noticed that each individual island had some very interesting differences. So he actually, like I said, he spent a lot of time on these islands and he would bounce back and forth. So smaller, low islands were often hot, dry, and barren. The larger, higher islands had great rainfall and it was way more lush with life and lots of diversity. So he noticed that according to the elevation, there was a much different, plant population that was then fueling or, allowing for a much different animal population to thrive. So the species on each island varied slightly in what he realized to be predictable ways. So it clearly appeared as though the organisms had adapted to life in their habitat. An example of this was with Darwin's finches, and finches are birds. There's probably a finch outside my window right here. So we have lots of finch species right here in Ohio. And he saw finch species in the Galapagos Islands. So what he realized was finches on each island had different beaks according to their diet. You can see on my picture here, a finch that ate primarily seeds had big, bulky, stronger beaks compared to something like the bottom right here that would eat insects. So insect eaters typically still today, show that they have more narrow little beaks to help them kind of like get in the nooks and crannies of, tree bark or wherever they may be trying to get insects to eat. So here's another example. I love this picture. So it shows what we call like the ancestral seed-eating ground finch. And then over time, depending on the habitat where they live, each finch slowly evolved a beak that was most appropriate for the diet, the food that was available to them. So again, here on the far right, well, actually there's a few. You can see some beaks are big and bulky and really strong. The warbler finch is primarily an insect eater, and so they had longer, skinnier beaks. He also looked at the land tortoises that were present in the Galapagos Islands, and here are some examples. They are huge, they can live to be very, very old, and they are awesome. But what he realized was that the physical shape of these tortoises changed depending on the island that they were living in. So you can notice here the difference in the size of their shell, even the shape of their shell, and so on. Here's just some pictures of how awesome. You can see how huge they are. So Darwin eventually wrote a book describing evolution, and he decided not to publish it because he was afraid of getting a negative reaction. So he knew that his discoveries were real and that it would change the world. And so he actually told his wife to publish it after he died. About 25 years later, he received an essay from another scientist about evolution, and he was shocked, and he had no idea that the scientist was actually studying the same thing. And so he panicked and decided while he was still alive, he published On the Origin of Species, which described his findings. So He kind of coined the term natural selection. So natural selection is the process by which favorable traits become more common in a population. So an example of natural selection would be, an organism, the size or shape or strength of their beak evolving to allow for it to be most suited for the food available. Okay, so there are specific, sorry, I want to see what it looks like in your notes. Yes, okay, so there are some specific conditions for natural selection to occur. And he listed these 5 things. So the first one is that all species have genetic variation. So some plants produce more fruit than others, some giraffes have longer necks, some deer run faster than others, etc. And so we need that genetic variation for evolution to occur. So basically, there needs to genetically be individuals that are more fit, most fit to survive and have more babies. We have to have a gene pool. So the gene pool is the sum of all the genes in a population. And genetic variation is created by gene shuffling, which was done in meiosis, or mutation. So sometimes, as we've talked about with mutations, sometimes now we see genetic mutations may actually be beneficial. An individual with a genetic mutation may actually be proved to be more successful. And so by God, they stay alive. They stay healthy enough, they have lots of babies, and they pass on that genetic mutation to their offspring. Their offspring then, if they get that gene from the parent, they would also be successful enough to survive and have babies and spread that gene. Okay. The second thing is the environment presents many challenges to an organism's survival. So animals constantly have to fight to survive. So animals have to catch food, they have to hide from predators, and plants need just the right amount of water, just the right amount of sunlight. They can't be eaten, and so on. So plants and animals every single day, pretty much every moment of every single day in the wild have challenges. And that has to be in place in order for natural selection to occur. There is some form of competition among the organisms of a species. So, for example, one tree releases millions of seed, but they don't all mature. So there has to be some type of competition between one organism or the other, even though they're the same species. So for example, right now, let's imagine that the trees, the oak trees of Kettering, Ohio in the fall dropped hundreds or thousands of acorns, right? Very few of those acorns are actually going to survive and grow into a new baby oak tree. The problem is most of those acorns get eaten, gobbled up, usually within a day of hitting the ground, honestly. They may be eaten by insects, they may be eaten by other animals, squirrels, chipmunks, right? Lots of organisms are eating those things. So again, very few of them actually succeed and are able to grow and mature. The fourth thing is survival of the fittest. So organisms that are better able to cope with challenges of their environment will survive and have more offspring, therefore passing these genes on. So I kind of talked about that already. So survival of the fittest is really an organism being really fit and suited for their environment to the point where they can obviously survive, number one. They can find a mate, they can breed, they can successfully have babies and pass on those genes. And the fifth one is over time, natural selection results in changes in the inherited characteristics of a population. So basically, we are increasing the actual fitness of the species. Okay, so here's an example of natural selection. We have these birds, they're loving the green beetles, right? Gobbling up those green beetles. Generations later, they're still gobbling up the green beetles. And because of that, the brown beetles have actually been allowed to survive, right? Because they haven't been gobbled up. And so they're surviving and having babies. So now the population of beetle is going to be primarily brown because they are surviving and successfully passing on the genes for that coloration. We also see a major current event, like real life issue right now, is with antibiotic resistance. So the use of antibiotics and other antibacterial products have increased dramatically for the past couple of decades. So what I mean by that is I think it's astounding that you can go to the grocery store and it's actually hard to find hand soap that's not antibiotic. I mean antibacterial. Dish soap, antibacterial. Paint. I have a picture on here because Sherwin-Williams has a paint that's actually antibacterial. The problem with all of these products flooding our system is that, you know what happens every time I put hand sanitizer on my hands, it kills almost all of that bacteria, except some are going to be resistant. So what's happened? Let's say an hour ago, I used hand sanitizer and now I'm just in my classroom teaching. The bacteria that's actually resistant to my hand sanitizer is going to survive, produce offspring. And now on my hands here, I am creating a strain of bacteria that is resistant to antibacterial soaps. And that's what we're actually seeing. We're seeing the same thing with antibiotic medications. So a couple decades ago, because we didn't know any better, medical doctors were just prescribing antibiotics. You know, you got a sniffle or whatever is, oh, you maybe thought you had some type of infection. Oh, here, just take an antibiotic. But the problem is we're now seeing that, you know, the few survivors that were resistant to the antibiotic medications survived and thrived. And now we have bacterial infections that are actually stronger than the antibiotic medications. So the medications are now just getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And to be honest, there's actually a lot that we can do without the use of antibacterial products. So until the pandemic, I never, ever, ever bought hand sanitizer. My kids had never used hand sanitizer. I don't buy soap with antibacterial, properties just because of this issue. Okay, so, and I will say too that the doctors now are being way more cautious because they've seen this. So doctors now are trying to be way more cautious when they're prescribing antibiotics as well. Okay, I think that's it. I don't need to go over this example. All right, so that is it for your first section of notes, and then you should move on to your Google Form assignment.